Hello and welcome back to the InterDrone podcast, your 30,000 foot view of the commercial drone industry. It is Wednesday, May 12th, 2021. My name is CJ Smith, joined today with Michael Peel, chairman of InterDrone, and our special guest, David Benowitz, head of research at DroneAnalyst. We put out a lot of great industry research, does some really great reporting, and we try to have David on whenever he puts out a report, and we can kind of dive into it. We'll put some links where you can learn more about some of the work that he's doing. But we're going to specifically talk about the latest drone market, drone hardware sector report, kind of forecasting 2021 to 2026, and we'll dive into some of the the broader trends and some of the areas of growth that that we're seeing in the drone market right now. Before we do that, David, if you could just provide a brief background of yourself for anyone that's not familiar, talk a little bit about DroneAnalyst and what you guys focus on, and specifically you focus on when you're doing these research reports.
Yeah, and thanks, Scott. Thanks, CJ and Mike, for having me on today. Sorry. So I'm very happy to be here today with the InterDrone podcast team. So as CJ mentioned, I'm head of research at DroneAnalyst, and at DroneAnalyst we provide realistic, fact-based analysis and research about the drone industry. And so every year we're kind of known for publishing our large annual drone market sector report, which is the largest survey and kind of publishing of data on market share, et cetera, in the drone space. And more recently, we published our first ever hardware sector report, which takes in different customs data as well as kind of other available data that we've had proprietary to DroneAnalyst to really understand how many drones are being sold today, what's the direction of the market, how large is it today, and where is it going? So yeah, I'm very happy to dive into it. As always, we're looking to cover the latest news and trends about the industry as well, and just make sure everyone's on top of what's happening in the industry.
Great. And I know there's one other article we wanted to touch on. So the American Drone Security Act. So today, basically, Congress meets to discuss the Security Act. It's a bill to ban federal procurement of certain drones and other unmanned aircraft systems for other purposes, specifically to ban federal procurement, with some exceptions of drones manufactured by a covered foreign entity, including the People's Republic of China. So I know this has been kind of a big topic for the past couple of years. David, any insight you can provide on the act, and what impact do you think this will have on kind of the broader industry?
Yeah, so this just passed through the Senate subcommittee earlier today, actually. So I'm happy we're addressing it and touching on it. And really, what this is looking to is to put into law a lot of these previous bills we've seen, but also Trump's executive order that we've seen around restricting the purchase and usage of federal funds to buy Chinese-made products, and specifically products from Chinese entities, and specifically DJI. Right. Whereas before we've seen a lot of the politicians address this as, for privacy or security issues. Well, they're much more blatant this time in saying this is about increasing competition in the U.S. market. So we have a bit more obvious background behind what this is intending to do. But essentially the goal is to put all the federal funds that are being spent on drones and moving that towards US made products.
Right. And what impact, and Mike, you could chime in too, do you guys see this having, and are there certain verticals within the drone industry this is going to impact more than others? For instance, public safety. I mean, that's what obviously comes to mind, and we've had some public safety professionals on the podcast before. Some are heavily affected and some not so much. But how do you see this kind of permeating through the industry?
Yeah, so I mean, first and foremost, it's going to hit the DoD spending on UAS, which is already pretty much following these rules, as well as the DOI, and a lot of other federal agencies are already kind of behaving behind the principles of this rule. Where it's going to affect most is what you mentioned already, which is public safety. This will eventually kind of trickle down into the grants that are given from the federal level to the state and local level, and will impact what drones are purchased with those funds. And so this is going to be a much larger issue when a service provider is operating for maybe a federal agency or maybe a local police officer is trying to buy kind of expanded parts of their drone fleet. So today in the market, everything is going to kind of slowly trickle in as the regulation comes into force. But the largest issue for me is we still don't have a player today that can service the broader market. most of the new U.S. drone hardware is struggling to deliver the supply of just their current demands. And when this comes through, the question is whether or not local and public safety officers will have access to affordable drone hardware. So, I'm always for kind of increased competition. And I think if we're looking at the DoD level, having them buying US made drones makes a lot of sense. But we do have to take a bit more of a balanced approach when we start to think about larger repercussions in public safety and what is the real trade-off that we're having here.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's a couple factors there, right? So is this really preventing a public safety official from buying an off-the-shelf Chinese drone? Probably not, but it does prevent them from scaling. And then that becomes a consideration of why invest in this if I can't scale it up? Well, for a small municipality, that might actually not even be a factor, flying under the radar, so to speak. Not that I would suggest that any public safety official would do so, but it's a possibility, right? Does this really affect other industries, or are they able to kind of wave it off and they're just saying, we're going to use what works for us and what we've invested in already, and we're not really concerned about what's going on with the kind of stateside stuff? Any kind of insights there?
Yeah, I've talked to a few organizations that kind of fit outside of this bubble that are impacted by similar regulations in the past, similar rules in the past, particularly their construction companies or service providers who are doing some type of operations, like about building new military bases, building airstrips near military bases, or kind of anything within that realm. So that's where it becomes a larger issue. Like we've even heard of several different service providers who are operating near a military base, having similar rules kind of enforced on them, even though technically it doesn't really fit in this situation. So there will be some of these kind of fringe cases that it impacts, but you're right, it is mostly limited to just a few key industries and areas of the market.
I imagine that has some effect though, right? Because if, let's say, you're a construction company that works on airports, let alone ones next to military bases, that you're gonna take that extra consideration, because if you have to put money and invest in building this program, why keep building into the ecosystem that's not going to allow you to work on 10 to 15% of your jobs? Why not just go from the other angle and use whatever's going to work across all 100%?
No, 100%. I mean, the organization I'm talking about has actually paused all of their purchases as they kind of review what's the best way for them forward. So this is kind of a net loss for the industry and for the customer at this time. But you're right. I mean, a lot of these guys will try to see if there is hardware they can use across all sites. The problem then becomes replacing workflows or replacing a whole tech stack, right? Because when you're replacing hardware, you're also replacing, what software is compatible with that? What's the actual workflow that we're having as well? Is it scalable? Do we have all the payloads that are compatible with the hardware available today? When we talk about construction, then there's no competitive all-in-one RTK hardware on the market today.
Right.
There's really just the Fan 4 RTK. So we're kind of diving into the weeds on that side, but you're right. I mean, when it comes down to it, there's a lot of net losses for a lot of these individual customers and slowing down of adoption.
Right. I want to read a quote from the DSPA, so the Drone Service Providers Alliance. Is an article on dronelife.com. So a total ban based solely on country of origin rather than on specific standards makes it difficult for public safety agencies or others that might utilize federal funds to find affordable aircraft that meets their needs. And it makes it very difficult for smaller domestic manufacturers to survive. This limits rather than encourages more U.S. manufacturing. And so the actual quote, first, the country of origin ban is a poor use of taxpayer resources, says the DSPA. It makes agencies and contractors pay more for less capable drones. We should encourage innovation by incentivizing domestic production, not banning procurement or contracting based upon country of manufacture. So I think, pretty, they're taking a strong stance on that. And I think for somebody that wants to see the industry kind of proliferate or see this technology proliferate, any kind of road bump or speed bump isn't, it slows this adoption. And even if it's just the narrative, I think we've talked about this on the podcast before too. I mean, even just seeing the headlines, that's enough to make people question things. So, you can totally see, it's tough. I see both sides of this. but maybe there is a way where it's not a complete ban, or you can just ban certain parts of foreign-made aircraft. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of how this really takes hold on the space.
Well, we got a comment from our friend Scott. So legislation as written does not allow contractors to use covered farm systems either. There are many likely unintended consequences that will from this legislation passing. So kind of feeding into what we were saying before, but also what was CJ was just talking about now. What were you going to say, David, before I cut you off?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point by Scott, and it's true in that, and that it's kind of in the rule. I would say Vic and Kenji always kind of on point. I agreed with kind of their whole statement there. You kind of, CJ, made a really good earlier point in that, which is a lot of people just seeing this news and thinking drone industry not growing or something like that. It kind of reminds you a lot, and we haven't really seen media reporting on this quite yet. It's really, just an hour or two old. So it'll be interesting to see how they do it. I remember when DJI was added to the entity list, you'd always kind of read the articles. The headline is, DJI banned in the US, which is not the true fact.
That's it, DJI banned.
Right. And yeah, I mean, for a lot of people, like there's no Mini 2 replacement in the market yet. So you can imagine a lot of people on this lower end of the consumer market being, well, can I buy a drone right now? Is there anything available to me today? So you can see a lot of those people questioning whether or not they should even make a purchase.
Right.
Yeah, it's weird because I wonder who the FUD is serving, right? Because it's not benefiting necessarily even the non-DJI drones. A lot of them, I think, early on with the kind of anti-China sentiment, took advantage to see if they could, get a spot at the table. And honestly, it's just kind of puts a dampening on kind of all drone conversations, period, because at some point, even if it's not the software, even if it's not the firmware, something on that drone is going to be from overseas.
And on that point, Mike, I want to read the second part of this quote from the DSPA. Yeah, it says, second, just about every single drone manufactured domestically has components manufactured in China. Everything from batteries to PCB boards, electronic speed controllers, motors, and wiring are manufactured overseas. It's just about impossible to find non-Chinese made components in this sector. Working with a small manufacturer, we had to have discussions about whether it would be okay to have batteries manufactured in China for their drones. We had to talk about whether it would be okay for them to ship printed circuit boards to China and have them assembled with lithium polymer cells that are made in that country. While the policy seems simple, its implementation will be a nightmare for manufacturers. And I think that's kind of what it talks about too, with the poor use of taxpayer dollars. It's the implementation and the enforcement of this. What is that going to look like, right?
Agreed. So the DoD releases an annual report every year talking about the industrial military complex and kind of what the capability is. And they actually just were very upfront with this and said kind of they took the Blue SUS drones, which are supposed to be, fully made in the USA products, and broke those apart and still saw that there's a significant amount of Chinese components in them. Yeah. And so they've even published that's available publicly. And, we can kind of say that, if these guys can't reach that mark, who really can today? I've talked with a lot of manufacturers. They're telling me they literally do not make motors of that type in the US anymore. Like that's all been moved abroad, and moving this type of motor design and manufacturing to the US is just it's not something one individual manufacturer really can do at the scale that they're at today. So it kind of leaves a lot of questions with, what can and can't be done in the US, and, maybe leveraging not Chinese, but like Vietnamese, Mexican, something like that type of supply chain makes a lot more sense. But there's kind of one caveat to this bill, which I think is better than what we've seen before. If you look at Trump's executive order on the subject and the NDAA bills, is that they do kind of change the definition of covered UAS. And I'm still kind of digging into this and kind of reacquainting myself with the bill. But they're mostly focusing on covered foreign entities instead of covered UAS. They still use the term covered UAS. But if you looked at previous rules, they define it in a specific way where they go through the components that need to be not made in China. Whereas this one is more focused on the entity that's assembling and manufacturing. And so I think that'll give these manufacturers a little bit more wiggle room to actually accommodate for Chinese-made components that aren't critical. So I think there's a little bit more wiggle room in this bill than if you looked at the previous ones. But that's a conjecture. If you're a drone manufacturer, consult a lawyer. Do your own due diligence on this. But I think there'll be this little nuance where we'll still see these economies intertwined. And even Rand Paul kind of spoke on this when defending, he's actually voting no against this act, speaking to the fact that, already the supply chain is so intertwined, it's hard to take this big step back. And so there needs to be some kind of leeway figured out in the rule.
Yeah, if we take a kind of step back away from the drone industry, there's a lot of supply chain anxiety, especially post-COVID, and it doesn't seem like those conversations are going to dissipate anytime soon. I mean, it doesn't matter what industry, Emerald, our parent company, is a big company, and all the different shows that we run are seeing some version of supply chain congestion, and the supply chain is China. It's at least overseas, right? So I think the bigger question is, what is the infrastructure investment going to be on the U.S. side if they truly want to divorce themselves, even in the minimal scope of the military industrial complex sourcing drones?
Well, it seems too that if this is a real concern, why are they stopping at drones, right? There's probably circuit boards in federal used computers that are made in China, right? So is this not kind of apples to apples across all federal, funds for procurement?
Yeah, so this is part of a larger kind of movement from the government, and it's part of, Biden's economic policy. Even if you go back to when he was running for office, was very upfront that they want to require that all federal funds are using kind of made in America steel, made in America products, et cetera. So I'd say this is pretty expected, and it's kind of, in this day and age, a little bit pretty bipartisan. There's not really anyone fighting against it to some degree. And I think when we're talking about federal funds, yes, it'll push the cost up for things the government is paying for. But I think it is kind of a nice, in general, direction. But when it becomes a larger kind of influence on the broader market, it becomes a larger issue. And for me, it's always the act, like, why are we calling it the American Security Act if it's really about competition? Let's kind of reframe the topic. I don't think anyone's against investing in U.S. domestic suppliers or just competition in the market. I think regardless of country of origin, the state of the drone industry is not healthy when it's this dominated by one player. So, an American drone competition act or something of that sort, I think would get a lot more support in the industry.
You're not the only one that said that, and I'm trying to think of the other source, but it's very true that reframing, like, it's almost like asking for the U.S. population not to get on board or to be scared of something rather than to put their energy and their American pride towards rallying towards building something, which I don't think America is in short supply of that type of sentiment. Like, just give them the target, and they'll fully be behind that. I think actually a lot of Americans are even asking for that, So
agreed.
Interesting. We'll see how. I'm sure things will break one way or another as we move on this, but definitely the topic that refuses to die, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I think we've been talking about it for over a year on the podcast now. So
yeah, I before that,
yeah, right.
There's always some new action on this side,
Right.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Well, and guys, just a quick reminder, anybody tuning in, we are coming to you live, so please drop a note in the chat, drop a question, drop a comment, just say hi, say where you're tuning in from, and we'll be happy to give you a quick shout out. I want to switch gears, and Dave, let's talk about the report. So the hardware sector report, title of the article that you sent over is "How Large is the Drone Market?" I'm sure that's a question you get a lot. So just starting at that, how large is the drone market? When people ask that, what do you usually say?
Yeah. So kind of after we've assessed, quite a lot of customs data and kind of our own proprietary surveying data and kind of mix and match the both of them, and then public financial data and all this good stuff. We've come out that when we value all the drone hardware sold as of last year in 2020, the market in total was 3.5 billion USD. And so, we were kind of joking about this before. We've always seen kind of the large conversations around, the size of the market being 100 billion by 2020 or something like that. So clearly we're far from the mark. There's a little caveat to that figure, which is I'm not including military and I'm not including kind of the traditional drones. We're just talking about kind of consumer imaging drones, like a Mavic, enterprise imaging, when we're talking about data acquisition for public safety, construction, et cetera, agriculture spraying, which we don't see that much in the US, but is rising pretty quickly outside of the US. And then creative professionals, things that we're talking about on film sets, professional photography in that ilk.
Right. Yeah, and that $100 billion mark, you linking to a Goldman Sachs report that said we could beat $100 billion by 2020. So, I think, and extending them a little bit of an olive branch. I think if you're looking at total addressable market, maybe they thought that we could have been somewhere there. There's obviously a number of factors that are coming into that. COVID, of course, being one of them. But it's looking at some of the figures in the report, it doesn't seem like COVID was as terrible for the drone industry as some other industries. And you mentioned that 3.5 billion in hardware sold in 2020, and that was a 46% jump over 2019. Is that surprising when you see that? Was that more than you guys would have thought?
Yeah. So in my initial look at it, it was definitely a large uptick. And when we looked at kind of the impact of COVID breaking out across our 4 different sectors, we saw the largest jump in agriculture spraying, which more than doubled. Which a lot of these are being used for disinfecting. So it made a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. Enterprise imaging grew a lot. And then consumer, we kind of always have a lot of conversations about, is this stagnating? Is it not? Obviously, our largest player in this space is a private company. So it's always been hard to kind of really understand where that market's gone.
Right.
And so while we did see a huge jump from 2019 to 2020 in the consumer space, this is actually kind of a reversal of an earlier trend, which is where we've seen it actually decrease year over year for 2 years beforehand. So if you kind of look back to 2017 to 2020, it's not as big of an increase as it was from 2019 to 2020. So it's kind of more of a returning to growth, right, instead of a huge COVID saving point.
Right. And so you guys broke the industry down into 4 sectors: creative professionals, agriculture spraying, enterprise imaging, and consumer imaging. Can you talk a little bit about what industry verticals kind of make up these 4 different sectors?
Yeah, so consumer imaging is pretty unique in that it's more defined by the intent of the operator themselves. So we're looking at, in general, products from about $200 USD to $2,000 USD that are purchased for hobbyist purposes. Mm-hmm. And we're able to actually get what are the actual consumer drones that are sold out there in the market through customs data. And then we do run our own kind of proprietary analysis and estimate which of those were purchased for enterprise or professional purposes. And so that's taken out of that segment. Creative professionals are, more professional drones. We don't have a price limit for anything other than consumer imaging. And professional drones are, based off of looking at professional drones used for kind of film, photography, professional purposes, where that's the main intended purpose. So if a consumer is using it and selling some photo stocks on the side, we're not counting it in that sector. Okay. Then enterprise imaging is, it could really be, it's the broadest sector. So whenever we're talking about kind of data acquisition drones for surveying above, mm-hmm. Doing actual surveying or just above a firefight as well is included in that space. Anything where it's collecting data for business or government purposes, right, except for the DoD. And then the last sector there is agriculture spraying, which is, the most concrete of the 4 sectors, which is just drones that spray pesticides or some type of chemicals, right, from the air.
And you mentioned the report. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
No, so it seems like that sector has been growing steadily and with confidence. Is that how I'm reading it?
Yeah, the ag space, right?
Yeah.
It's been exploding. So that's our highest growing sector for last year. So it grew by 135%. So that's kind of the largest growing sector there. And it's not something we see in North America or even Europe, really. It's mostly focused in the Asia region, where, we've started to see farmers really deploy at scale these agriculture spraying tools. There's also obviously a COVID uptick, which is a lot of governments have purchased these products to also disinfect stadiums and et cetera, a lot of areas. And we've seen a lot of marketing in that direction. I would just say that there's a lot of research publications that it's not an effective way. So it's kind of security theater more so than an actual solution. So that'll be eventually trigger like a downward trend in the next year. So that's where kind of not estimating we'll see this type of doubling over in the years to come, but we're certainly seeing the agriculture market itself, just ignoring disinfecting drones, really explode.
So I've heard the argument that ag or drones for ag in the United States was slower growth than expected because we already have pretty efficient systems for our larger farms, especially factory farms. Do you think that the reality on the ground in the APAC region makes it easier to scale spraying drones, or is it actually that there's just kind of more of a specific environmental need to use drones for spraying rather than other kind of types?
Yeah,
of
it's all
systems?
of the above plus government actions. So certainly the core economics of agriculture is just different in APAC than it is in the US. I mean, they have more mouths to feed. They have less land to use to feed them. And then just in general, agriculture is more on small plots instead of large plots, and tend to be a little bit more vertical when we're talking about geography than we see in the States, or even Europe for that matter. Although Europe is a bit better of a market for this type of spraying drone than the US. So that's kind of like the core economics of it. Also, just the adoption of technology is quite low already. So they're kind of in some ways skipping a generation to technology that's better for them. And then we've also seen a lot of government subsidies and government action be taken to lower the cost and lower the price for these type of machines. So, I mean, you can imagine, right? A farmer doesn't have that much income when we're talking about owning a small plot of land. And so the government's really stepped in, specifically in China, but it's also starting to see outside of China as well, to really help to lower the cost of the initial machine purchase and, make sure that they can actually invest in this technology that's both good for their health and more efficient. And this ties into a lot of other labor issues in APAC as well, which is, they have a lot more people, but also a lot of them want to leave the rural areas. So they want to kind of keep some of the younger ones there as well. And so this is kind of a lot of these countries see it as kind of reinvesting into these communities that are the backbones of their nation.
That's a fascinating take I haven't heard before, and something that I definitely want to look more into. Because I do know about, kind of the, I don't know if you call it flight to city, but the move to cities in the APAC region, because there's rapid development, right? You're seeing cities pop up overnight in certain regions of China, right?
Yeah.
So
literally, you'll see new city centers every few months.
Right. And it's there's no embedded infrastructure where they're doing popping up those cities, right? So they're really getting to kind of start from scratch without having to kind of have the burden of hooking in with an old, 120-year-old sewer system like we have in New York. If you want to build a subway in New York City, it will take you 100 years now. Facts.
Longer than it took them 100 years ago.
Right. Did it in a decade.
Right.
It's increased tenfold.
Right.
I suppose worker conditions have improved since then too. That kind of slows things down.
True. Right.
Yeah.
David, and one of the kind of big points here too in the report, a resurgent DJI pivoting to the commercial market. So you guys had seen weak sales numbers in the consumer imaging space until the end of 2019. At the same time, DJI's enterprise imaging and agriculture spraying businesses grew rapidly. And despite DJI's overall strength and dominance in the market, they are comparatively weaker in high-growth enterprise sectors than the consumer market, where they control 94%. So anybody tuning in the bottom right, you'll see those graphics rotating, and you'll see this this chart with the DJI drone hardware revenues and by sector. So they actually saw a huge increase from 2019 to 2020, almost 30% in their revenue. What kind of takeaways do you have when you see those figures? And was a COVID kind of spur in revenue, or was there kind of some broader work that DJI was doing, or some other initiatives they were doing to capture that, this new $800 million?
Yeah. I would say when you look into it, DJI did introduce the Mavic Mini at the end of 2019. So we really saw this new kind of mini quad category that's, right below where the regulations pretty much start, which I know is not 100% correct, but, for kind of rhetorical purposes. This new segment is kind of an innovative point for them. That sub 250 gram drone, sub 0.55 pound drone has been also something that's helped to spur this growth. And then it is kind of looking back to 2017, kind of going back to that type of years when we look at the market demand and the market size as well for them. So it is much more of a resurgence than just a COVID bump there as well. Whereas kind of the commercial agriculture space has been growing pretty steadily and very strongly for them as well. So it's kind of a mix of all of the above, but we've definitely seen their dominance rise significantly in the consumer space year over year. We did still see a few different players in 2018, 2019, and they've pretty much exited the market entirely. For example, Parrot has, there's still Anofis on the market, but they're not making new Anofis. They're focusing purely on the military and commercial space. I think is a really good example of a company who's kind of made way for DJI in the consumer space.
Mm-hmm. And DJI controlling 94% of the consumer segment. How has that trended over the last few years? I mean, we all know they're obviously a dominant force, but is that actually increasing even by a little bit? I mean, there's not much more market for them to capture, but is that increasing?
Yeah, it's been increasing in the consumer space steadily year over year, and mostly in 2020, just because so many people exited in 2019. Right. So yeah, it's a market increase, but DJI's always been above 80%. As kind of we've been the first people to really grab this type of detailed customs data and work on this level of kind of nuanced data. And when we look at it in more detail, people have always said 70%, and our own report, kind of based off of survey data, does kind of show a 69% market share when we're looking at the commercial space. And we definitely see that lower market share as well in our new data as well. But when we look at the consumer space, it's it's quite a different picture.
So I've seen you on Twitter talk about former colleagues leaving DJI and there kind of being a culture shift there. Barring the kind of interpersonal stuff, what do you think the strategy is that's affecting that change, and what direction is the company looking in that kind of key players when they were initially growing in the United States are no longer either willing to work there or viewed by the company as necessary to work there?
Yeah, it's a very
tough question.
Very tough question to answer.
That's what I'm here for.
It's a really good question. I mean, when I first joined DJI, which was back in in 2016 / end of 2015 actually, and I did a short stint and then came back. And at that time, DJI was kind of famous for being the only Chinese brand in any market to really innovate and be there. And you saw a lot of talent from actually abroad. So a lot of Chinese people from abroad then coming back, working for DJI. They speak English first. They generally are Cantonese. They have kind of, most of them are trilingual or speak 4 languages actually. And as the brand has become a much more traditional kind of just large Chinese brand over time, it's definitely recruited a lot more people who are, and there's kind of a cultural divide in China between North and South. And to speak very broadly, they're hiring more Northerners who tend to speak less English and only speak, Mandarin and maybe one other dialect, if that. So there's a very different makeup of actual Chinese employees in DJI as well, and they've also stopped hiring a lot of international talent. When you're on the entity list, it's hard to hire foreigners. When you kind of build up a certain stigma as a certain corporation, it's also hard to hire foreigners. And then all Chinese companies that I've talked to, and a lot of people I know who've gone to other Chinese companies, they really do have a large organizational struggle of, running an truly international organization, because there's a huge communication barrier. There's a huge cultural difference as well. And so it's very hard for them to retain international talent. So I'd always say it's kind of because of the technology and the innovation from DJI, they've been able to hold on to people like Romeo for so long. But it was never really fully sustainable, just because of the nature of the organization itself.
Interesting that it's not only external socio-political forces, it's also internal, kind of within China, socio-political forces that are kind of driving.
And definitely a lot of Chinese companies, and maybe this is kind of interesting context as well, when you're looking at just the Chinese companies in China, how they're operating, the government in China is telling them they need to focus more on the domestic market, and they need to focus on domestic demand as well. And they need to focus on their own core technologies. And DJI is certainly doing all of that. I mean, they're not giving up on the international markets, but it's something that's part of this ecosystem, and they're at the front part of the US-China conflict. So they're also going to get a lot of people who a lot of Chinese people want to be at the forefront of the battle of the move to the domestic push as well. And it's a nationalistic thing. It's the same. An American company would have the same thing in this situation that a Chinese company would. And so they're hiring people just inherently different in China, where they hire most people. that are inherently different than who they would have hired in 2017, 2018.
It does seem different than like if we were to go back to 2008, where you'd hear economists throw around the word Chimerica, like this kind of international relationship where China makes the goods, we buy the goods, they buy our debt. To now where it does seem like it's becoming more balkanized, just in the conversation. Like you use the words conflict and battle. I don't even know if that was intentional, but it does seem to speak to the change in the environment and the way that kind of trade is spoken about.
Yeah, certainly. And a lot of China comes from a lot of militaristic backgrounds. So they use a lot of militaristic language as well. There was an article by DroneAnalyst a while ago who publicized like how DJI is restructuring or whatnot. And
I remember
when
this
they actually
one, yeah.
label the regional teams, they call them Jianshu, which means like war zone. Actually, it doesn't mean region; it means war zone. And you can kind of imagine like that's not abnormal. It's not to say that DJI is a militaristic organization. That's pretty natural in China for salespeople to call their areas war zones. So there's kind of a cultural difference than I think what we would see here.
Yeah, like military theaters in the United States, right? That's that term has different meanings, but
yeah. You would never see that in a corporation when they're planning out their strategies.
Right. Well, so we talked about DJI. Revenues decreasing 2017, 2018, 2019, and then increasing about 25% up to 2020. Now, looking at Parrot, diving into their financials, there's a little section in the report, and they decreased from 2018, 2019, 2020, from 2018 to 2020, almost 50%, 50% decrease in revenue. What do you kind of make of this? You mentioned the Anafi, they're not even making that anymore. They're really focusing on military. What insight can you share about Parrot and some of the things that have impacted their bottom line?
Yeah, I like to use them as an example of just how hard it is to pivot your entire supply chain. Because, what they've been trying to do, and if you actually kind of look into the details of like which sector is growing, which sector is not, and this is all public financials data, you'll see that, their software, their fixed wing drones are all kind of stable or trending upwards.
Right.
But when you look at like their core drone brands, they're all trending downwards. Part of that's their own, decision to move away from the consumer market, which has been their bread and butter for the longest time. And then their decision to make the Anafi USA kind of solely in the US. And so, they made that decision over a year and a half ago. And we're only hearing now of them actually shipping units to customers, and maybe being some early issues as with any hardware when it first comes to market on a new production line. And so it just shows like how hard it is to actually do that shift of production and really get up and running. And yeah, it's a tough position for them to be in as kind of they're draining cash. They need to invest in a whole different supply chain, a whole different type of organization when they're moving into the military space.
Right. Yeah, the software is, like you said, trending up. It looks like their sensor business is relatively stable, and then
which they sold off. So that okay. I included it, but they did sell it off.
The Mica Sense, and then fixed wing drones relatively stable, but then you mentioned consumer drones and commercial drones. 50% decreases over those 2-3 years.
Yeah, and it's in an industry where there's not many public companies. It's bad news when the one public company in these operating in these spaces has this downward trend. Right. I would just say for people kind of outside the industry, this does not reflect a larger downshift in the market. It's still trending upwards. It's just, right. Especially a lot of the spaces where Parrot's working in are hyper competitive. When we're thinking about the Blue SUS group, it's, essentially government sanctioned that they want over competition in the space. And it makes it tough for any one individual player to, really build out and scale out an organization like that.
Right.
Yeah, because one of the goals of that kind of operation is to make sure that we're at least synthetically recreating market conditions, because they don't want to get back into the same arrangement that they have with the Lockheeds of the world, where the market is so thin that they actually can't produce, robust systems that are consistently evolving. Well, I guess Lockheed's not sponsoring anytime soon. So, CJ, next question.
Well, the next section, you talk about competition, and I think this is a really interesting point. The product segments where DJI faces competition make up less than 20% of their sales. So not only do they have, there's some monopolistic, market share that they have, but it seems like even in where they do face competition, it's not even their primary businesses or their primary segments.
Yeah, and I think this kind of ties back into what we talked about with the American Drone Security Act, which is, we're all for increasing competition in the market. And so I was really happy to kind of share this data point, because I think it's really important to manufacturers to start to figure out, what models do they need to compete with to actually generate revenue? Because right now, every manufacturer is working in one or two different models. They're all trying to compete with the Mavic 2 Enterprise Dual and the M300. And, we're starting to see the Blue SUS group kind of create this market for them in the government space, but it's a very narrow niche in itself. And it's driving only a small portion of DJI's actual revenue. And so, this type of government action is in some way kind of forcing these market players to enter into the only kind of protected segment they have, which then becomes hyper competitive in itself. So yeah, even though they're able to be at a higher price than DJI, there's still 6-7 drones in this one very narrow competitive space, and they're all releasing their first products. Maybe there's not enough volume to really keep all of them going. And so this is kind of where I see like these organizations, they're getting funding now. They need to start pivoting elsewhere, and it's a really critical time for them to start choosing where they're going to make those investments.
Right.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I don't think often gets kind of discussed is, the power that you have to unseat with DJI is the fact that that supply chain is locked down, right? They've got that working efficiently, but they also have it working efficiently at scale. And when you get to scale, there's optimizations and efficiencies that just come with that. That in these smaller market sectors, even if one of these brands is successful, can they approach the scale that actually creates a robust product that's able to develop and evolve?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I would say even let's take even an earlier step, which is let's compete with them on the right verticals and in the right segments. And I think Autel's a good example of this, which is, certainly they don't have the same amount of quantity that DJI has. Definitely they have benefits of also being a Chinese organization, but, they price their consumer products a little bit higher than DJI and, have some recurring revenue from that. And, it kind of shows that the market's willing to kind of move away from DJI, at least a small portion of the market, small enough to persist, a company in this space. And, these new players need to start thinking, where is this niche where I can build a base from? And if they're all choosing the same base, it's not going to work out. Because once they can start getting their niche, then they can start really advancing their core technology, advancing their core supply chain as well, and getting that scale. It's all step by step. But right now, when they're all jumping into the same narrow rabbit hole, it's a dangerous place for them and for the industry.
Right. Yeah, where do you guys see the Blue SUAS segment going? Do you see that there'll be one or two players that will kind of be the kind of de facto go-to drones for federal agencies, or do you think it can really survive with, like being a competitive segment, and having 5 or 6, I don't know, a handful of options?
Yeah. So we are seeing the DIU kind of change it, and Mike made a really good point earlier, which is like they are really trying to change at least how they've worked with the industry in the past. And so this Defense Innovation Unit who runs the Blue SUS group is, that's their core function. That's what their job is, not in drones, but just everywhere. And drones is kind of one of their first hotbed test points to test it out. And so they are moving to a new Blue SUS standard. They have a Blue SUS 2.0. And part of that is a little bit more robust than what we saw with 1.0. For example, requiring a certain level of production capacity and also a kind of a larger drone in itself. So we'll see it's a little bit more flexible. It's a little bit more reactive to market needs and also requiring kind of a production capacity. So I think we won't see the same issues we saw with the Blue SUS 1, where they're all meeting a very specific spec list, and therefore we see 5, 6, 7 drones competing in literally the same exact spec list.
Right.
So we'll see a bit more diversity moving forward. So I'm a little excited to see where that goes. I think it's always a question of how big is the military market? Is it big enough to sustain all these players? If we have not one but two lists of 5 companies each, can we sustain 10 vendors? Maybe there's overlap and whatever. But yeah, that's the core kind of question I have as well.
Right.
So it'll be very interesting. It's very exciting. I find the whole DIU space quite fascinating because it kind of changes a lot of my own personal biases and assumptions on how the DoD kind of works and how federal procurement works as well.
Right.
I think it's one of the single most important initiatives for the DoD as far as, it represents a radical culture change that actually understands the role that technology has played in the last 30 years of economic development in the public sector, right? Or in the business sector. And knowing that that's actually an advantage, the question is the philosophy of a military's need for asymmetric advantage antagonistic to having kind of a market-driven approach to development? And it might be that even setting specs, like you said, has hobbled V1 here, where even now they're realizing like, okay, maybe that's too constrictive. We need to open up even more.
Or like, yeah. Or if they're laying these specs out, does that spur innovation because these organizations are essentially building to meet specs as opposed to just building, the most useful products or actually just trying new things? Are they too, do you get too narrow then because you're just trying to build to specs which, a non-drone manufacturing organization came up with?
I've got that answer.
Yeah.
No.
No, yeah, agreed. The answer is definitely no.
Building to spec is inefficient compared to building to pain point and resolving actual problems with solutions.
Right.
So it's kind of an interesting tangent here, which is we can borrow some lessons learned in the Chinese market. So if you look at like 3 years ago, a lot of Chinese state-owned enterprises and also government agencies were kind of required to spend a certain amount of budget on drones. And so they would develop these very elaborate spec sheets that asked for very large drones that looked very impressive to impress bosses and get promotions. And they would essentially get these drones that couldn't fly or couldn't carry payloads because they didn't develop payloads for them because they weren't on the spec sheet. And this was a really big issue in China like 3-4 years ago. And I've seen a lot of it personally where it's like these operators and just had like a showroom of drone hardware that they didn't fly, they never used. And then in the back, they'd have real hardware that they could use, but they didn't show the bosses that stuff. So I would say like that's kind of what we're in some way creating. And I think China market is 3-4 years of this government corruption ahead of the US. But I think we're moving away from that. But I think to go back to the core point, like the Blue SOS Group 1.0, it did play a nice role in that. It started to really cement that a market could exist of US-made drones in a specific spec sheet that's competitive with the Chinese company. And so that's a nice playing point. Is it overall healthy for the market in the way it was done? No, they're improving it. But yeah, it was more of a really early test bed. So I wouldn't regret that it happened, but I would say overall it's kind of a failure in many ways.
I think it was an important first step. I really do. I mean, in terms of changing kind of military cultural perspective on how you can approach development and sourcing new technologies. If they got it right on the first time perfectly, then I'd actually be surprised. So that's agreed.
Right. I mean,
that would never happen.
But at least they're creating competition, right? They're not picking one manufacturer and saying, "Hey, build this drone, and this is going to be what all federal funds are approved to use."
Yeah.
Right. Well, David, I don't think we've had you on since, I guess, the end of 2020. We talked about this a lot at the beginning of the year. We talked about remote ID a lot. Just curious to hear some of your thoughts about the ruling. Curious to hear some of your insight on network versus broadcast, and just any thoughts you have on that.
Yeah, I mean, I've always kind of seen remote ID as a potential hamper to the industry in some way in kind of the short term. And I like the way that the FAA kind of took their approach. It's, almost too conservative on the timeline with how simple I think it is to actually implement. But overall, my own estimate is like the cost to the customer, the cost of the industry as a whole is pretty much zero. Any kind of manufacturer telling you they can't really do it is not very sophisticated, and they can figure it out pretty easily on their current drones, even.
Really? So it's not even like a burden for retrofitting, like if they have leftover stock?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're a hobbyist, I should say, like, if you're a recreational hobbyist building your own airframe, then it's a bit of a PETA, to not use bad language. But yeah, for existing manufacturers for drones in the market, I know DJI has gone on record pretty much saying they could probably do it over firmware. Skydio's done the same. Just the way that the technology is already in the drone, actually. They already have a transmission chip in the device. That's how they communicate with the remote controller. They just need to send out a separately encrypted, a separately embedded signal as part of that.
Right. So what's the next report, David? And, what do you guys kind of look into, as we get into the second half of this year?
Yeah. So shortly, we're working on kind of getting up and running our annual market survey and report, earlier in the year this year, so we can kind of show some of that data at events like InterDrone later in the year. So that'll be coming out in about a month, and so keep your eyes peeled for that. Cool. We'll also have, right now we're kind of still in the early stages of doing kind of a better way to assess security features and requirements for drones as well. The idea being that we've seen a lot of talk about drone security. We've seen a lot of discussion from manufacturers about what makes a drone more or less secure. But let's spell that out a bit clearer. What features are really beneficial for what type of operators, and what's kind of the minimum level of security features you need for what type of operations. So that's also another thing I'm diving into. That's something that'll go on our website. We're still not 100% sure exactly when I'll publish that. Sure. In the early stage.
Sure. And for anybody tuning in, we got a couple minutes left, so please send us your questions if you have them. And David, I know we're kind of coming up on an hour. I know it's probably getting late for you too. But any kind of final thoughts? It's obvious. I think you bring a unique perspective just because it's such a high level, kind of macro level, work that you guys do and insight that you can share. What's I guess is kind of really piquing your interest as of late. What are you really focused on? What's been exciting? Anything like that?
Yeah. Actually, I was just thinking this is part of both something I'm working on, but also I think a larger trend in kind of the military space that we were talking about earlier, which is kind of the rise of open source. So all the new Blue SUS stuff has been requiring some type of open source component. And so I think that's just really fascinating overall, and just the tech space that the military is now asking for open source flight controllers and communication protocols, which is, just interesting in the larger scheme of technology, that we're kind of seeing open source a lot more adopted and relied upon. So yeah, I'd say that's kind of the other topic, and just excited to see kind of where the industry takes us this year.
I mean, just hearing open source and military in the same sentence, right? It's kind of something I wouldn't have expected.
No, when I first read those solicitations, I was like, that's crazy. And then you kind of get into it, and it's like every new solicitation the DIU has is asking for more open source stuff. So it's not just the early requirement. It seems they're really enjoying it. But it makes sense in this stage of the industry where, right, manufacturers can't develop their own proprietary stuff necessarily, and the DoD wants to start, swapping between things. If you can have one remote controller work with, different robots or different drones all in one, I mean, that's a nice dream. So hopefully we get there.
Right.
Well, think about it. If you're an engineer at one of the big military vendors, and you've hit a roadblock in your day on trying to work out this drone software, what do you do to get the answer? You don't sit there and keep working on the problem with a pen and paper. You Google it. Yeah. So that means you're getting your answer from the open source community anyway. Right. You might as well officiate it and know that whatever you're dropping in is not coming from Stack Overflow. It's actually coming from a secure edition of that code.
Yeah, something in production.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was going to say. It's a good way to kind of understand a new market, right? When you don't even know all the possibilities that are out there, what tools are out there, what software solutions are out there, and the technology is changing so quickly. I mean, it's a good way to just kind of get your bearings, I think, right? And especially when these are big decisions that lots of money is involved, lives potentially involved when you're talking about the military. So, I guess, I think it's weird because we don't usually see that, but it does make sense when you think about that they're just opening up the stream of information, essentially, right?
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah, well, software races to zero really fast, right? Hardware a little bit slower, but still races to zero, right? Always gets cheaper over time, in general, unless a market falls off, like desktop computers. But the one thing that really drags and holds its value is human services. So tech support you could always charge for that, right? And that becomes the product differentiator no matter what domain you're working in. So yeah, why not open source the software? It just accelerates the development and what you're able to produce. And then it's about the team you bring together and the service you provide to in this case, the single buyer of the military.
Right.
Yeah, I'd love to see it happen more on the commercial side as well. Because it solves a lot of the problems we talked about earlier, like a construction company being able to diversify hardware quickly. So yeah, it's all around pretty exciting stuff.
Right. Well, great, David. And where can people, we'll put the link to the report in the description of the podcast, but where can people either get in touch with you on Twitter or, check out some of the work you're doing at DroneAnalyst, and then even, read about the report, read kind of the table of contents, what's inside, and eventually purchase it if they'd like to.
Yeah. So, you can check out our Twitter account at DroneAnalyst, and then obviously our website is DroneAnalyst.com. And, on that, if you're kind of a drone manufacturer investor, the full report has a lot more data that, we don't make publicly available when it comes down to actual unit sales by month, by model, by each manufacturer, which is kind of happy. I think we're the first to ever be able to offer anyone that. And then if you're just kind of interested to learn more about kind of the methodology behind it, or just the overall insights in a written blog form, you can also go to our website, and we have our blogs at the bottom. And you can go, the blog title, which you already mentioned, is How Large is the Drone Market, I believe.
Yeah.
So you can also check that out for a bit more on the written side.
Yeah. These are definitely great insights. At InterDrone, we put together, brand plans for the year, and sometimes it's tough to find some of this data, right? And tough to find which verticals are growing and especially trending year over year. So we obviously appreciate the work you're doing. It's just great to be able to dive into some of this stuff and look at the numbers. So, thanks again for joining us, and you always have a spot on this podcast when you push out a report. So we'll hope to see you again soon. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and have a great rest of your week.
Yeah, thanks CJ. Thanks Mike. Have a good one.